Now it's on.
Yeah.
تمام يا سلام. يلا let's go. Can you go with him?
Ready.
Ready?
Ready.
Yeah. Okay. That's good. خلاص.
كل معنا السلام عليكم. السلام عليكم. كمان مرة السلام عليكم جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته. جميع الضوء على يمكن نصور من الضوء طبيعيا بعد فترة اللي فاتت كانت اونلاين. شكرا لكم. لازم على اليسار كبير من الموضوع يكون شكل أفضل ممكن يعني تنسى الأشياء متعودين دكتور بس من الناس متعود على الخطاب كنا أرسلنا على الجروب الخطأ إنه عندنا امتحان تي في إكزام إنه راح يجي أي أحد حابب إنه يسوي بيزد أون لايسنس أو فيرجن أو شيك رايت المسؤول على ال FAA على الأساس، ولكن في هذه الفترة صار إنه في خلافات إنه هل هو مخول إنه يؤدي هذه الاختبارات برا الستيت أو لا، فهنا صار إنه أوكي ولكن اجتمعنا سوا حصلنا إنه ما شاء الله senior certified long experience in the field and safety team speaker in the field. فقلنا لا هذا المجال لازم يستفاد منه. Actually we had a very good meeting a few days ago. كل شيء كان يتكلم فيه كان to the point وكذا على البال مباشر. وكان يتكلم أكثر عن السيفتي خلى الواحد يعني يفكر أكثر. كلنا pilots, students, seeking license, owners أو حتى هو بهذا الشخص لما يكون يحب الشيء يهتم بالتفاصيل يمكن تبعد شوية عن نفس السبب. كيف إن أنا أريد الإيربلين بعد ذلك يصير معنا كيف اللاندنج how nice the airplane is, how far it went, how good my communication, but actually how safe I am. هذه the biggest question. مسؤولية علينا جميعا سواء كان معنا ركاب أو معنا كل الباسنجرز اللي يطلعوا معنا ما عندهم خلفية عن الطيران وما يعرف كيف يتم. فحتى بين الطيارين كذا اللي ما لهم فترة في المجال يقول إنه الباسنجر يقيم إنه الحالة خطر أو لا من تعبيرات البايلوت هو ما يدري هل هذه السيتويشن موجود في turbulence whatever راح يشوف الطيارة هل الرهبة هل انه مختلف مع البروجرس؟ واي؟ لان انا كباسنجر انا ما اعرف، وبالتالي انا وثقت في الطيارة نطلع معه ونياكلني في رحلة سواء شورت تريب ولا لونج تريب. فأنا كطيار لازم يكون قد هذه المسؤولية. كيف؟ هاو سيف. فهو هذه مسؤولية أنا تحملتها بدون ما هو يقول لي أنا حملتك مسؤولية. مسؤولية الأهلي اللي طلعوا معايا. حتى لو طالع الحالة وبعض الشباب يمكن حماسه شوي زيادة يقول أنا طاير سولو أنا ما أعرف. حتى لو طاير سولو عليه مسؤولية أصحابنا والناس اللي ينطقوا هذا المجال. هذه كلها مسؤولية سواء كان متسمى أو حتى تحالف. كل هذه الأشياء أسئلة كثير وكثير وكثير لازم من الواحد يصير وقفة نجتمع يكون عندنا experience person can tell us more and more. So Captain Matt, sorry for the best of luck in Hangar. I'm happy to have him and to have you here. And please, am I say pilot.
Assalamu alaikum. I am extremely pleased to be here, and I feel very, very honored. I have flown with many Saudi pilots over the years as an examiner. And so when I first started flying with Saudi pilots, I would always start the check ride by asking, where are you from? Is anybody else in your family a pilot? Why do you want to be a pilot? What do you want to do? And all of the ones who were from Saudi always would say, you have to visit my home. You have to come to Saudi Arabia. You will love it. You will love it. And so for years, I have met Saudi Arabian pilots who have said, is it not on yet? How about right now?
No, it's not.
Now it's not on?
Yeah.
How about?
Yeah. One.
Now it's on? No?
Yeah.
Now it's on?
Yeah.
Test. All right.
Good.
Yeah, that's louder. But I have met Saudi Arabian pilots over the years that have told me, you have to go visit my home. You have to visit Saudi Arabia. You will love it. You will love it. You will love it. And I finally got a chance to go. And just 3 weeks ago, I was at the airport in Florida, and one of the pilots at a school there from Riyadh asked me, when are you going to visit? When are you going to visit? And I said, actually, I'll be there in 2 weeks. And he was so happy. But when I got here, this has been better than they have told me that it would be. I love everything that I've seen. You have a wonderful country, and I have been around the world as a pilot, but the hospitality that I have witnessed here is wonderful and unmatched. So if I'm causing this, I'll try and fix it. But I am happy to be here, and I'm happy to be speaking to you. I started flying. My first flight lesson was when I was in high school. In my almost last year of high school, I was in my physics class, and I was not doing very well. I was doing okay in math. I was doing okay in English. But in physics, I was not doing very well at all. And because I wasn't doing well, my professor said, you will stay after and we will talk. And I knew I was in trouble. And so I went to his office, and he was not there, but I went in anyway. And all around his walls, I could see pictures of him flying jets, and he was a pilot. And so when I sat there and waited for him, I went through his pictures and I looked at his office, and I realized that my professor was a jet pilot. And when he came in the office to scold me, and he saw me looking at his pictures, and he said, Matt, what do you want to do with your life anyway? And I said, I really want to be a pilot. And he said, well, you have to have physics to be a pilot. So this Sunday, you come flying with me. So I went out to the airport. He had an airplane, and he made me do all of the work. I had to pull it out. I had to untie it. I had to check the fuel. He made me work. But when we got in the airplane and took off and started to fly, for the first hour, he taught me how to fly. This is how we turn. This is how we go up. This is how we go down. He just taught me how to fly. And after an hour, then he retaught the entire year of physics using the airplane. And so he was a great teacher that taught me first how to love flying and then how to make it work by working hard in school. And so as I approached aviation, one of the things that I've always tried to remember is that the people around you watch what you do, they listen to what you say, and all of us help each other as we're learning how to fly and learning how to be better pilots and better instructors and better evaluators and all of the things that we do. So tonight, AJ had asked me to talk about flight safety. And so we're going to talk about that from the standpoint first of the pilot. And then later, we're going to talk about the flight instructor and the evaluator. But as we go through it, one of the most important things that we want to talk about is the attitude of the pilot and the attitude towards safety. You are at a wonderful time in aviation. This is a great time to be involved in flying. We get to see things as pilots that the people that came before us could only dream about. The opportunity to fly small jets, large jets, to fly light sport aircraft, to fly all of the different types of aircraft that are out there and have that opportunity. This was not available in the years past. And I was told that this flight club has really grown from just a few airplanes in a hangar to 99 airplanes. And as aviation is growing in Saudi Arabia, more and more people will be exposed to being a pilot. And the pilots that are flying right now have a huge impact and responsibility on where everything is going in the future. The safer that you are right now, that will affect the pilots that are coming after you. That'll affect the way aviation grows in your country. And that'll also affect the way the public sees aviation around you. So the attitude of the pilot is the most important part of aviation safety. And one of the things that I've learned over the years and have been taught, they've always taught us and come back to, is the way you approach every single flight is important. It's not enough that all of your other flights were safe. What is very important is that the next one is safe. And the way that you approach that as a pilot is very important. I have a young man that I am mentoring as a CFI back in America, and he's very young. He is a flight instructor, and his grandfather was a pilot, and his grandfather flew an airplane like we have out here, much like the Cirrus. And he flew, and he used to fly with my best friend that I grew up with. And one day they were flying and they were on a trip. Both of them were lawyers, and they were flying back from a trip, and the weather began to deteriorate and it began to get bad. And they were reporting that it would be IFR, and then they would be reporting that it would be low IFR. And then certain airports began to close because the fog was so low. But this man had a problem in that he had a macho attitude of, I can do it, I can do it, I can do it. And he was current legally, but he wasn't proficient. He met the regulations of when he needed to shoot instrument approaches, but he didn't do it a lot. And he wasn't ready for that night. And he killed a plane load of people, and he killed my best friend and his grandson, who I'm now training, does not have his grandfather, because his grandfather had an attitude of, I was successful in the past, I will be successful tonight. And he wasn't. And one of the things that we have to remember as pilots and remember as we go out is that the attitude of safety is one of right now, not one of what it used to be. And so I remember as a pilot, my instructor used to always teach me everything you did to get you to this point is what you have to do to get you to the next point. And so the attitude of safety was very, very important. Do we have something for the slides that would move it like a clicker? Okay, so when we're approaching safety and we're approaching flight training, sometimes we have an idea that flight training is what we do to get to the point of buying a certificate, and then we are finished with training. But just as there are doctors in the room that know that when you finish medical school, there is still more to learn. There are still more things that you're studying and watching and reading. Pilots are the same way. If you are going to be safe as a pilot, go through your flight training for the purpose of being safe. But then to be safe, you continue with your flight training. We have a saying that we say all the time in America, that a good pilot is always learning. It's important to remember that those two things are linked. From time to time, we will, as pilots, stop getting better at what we do. And I know as a pilot examiner that that's easy for me. When I started out flying, and I started out as a, there was one little airplane, it was a 152, it was at an airport near my home, and I learned how to fly that. And then I moved up and started flying twin engines, and I became a flight instructor and realized that I really enjoyed flying, but I really enjoyed teaching. There was a point in my flying as a flight instructor where I stopped studying because I was too busy. And I also had an attitude in myself that I knew everything already because I was a teacher. And then I started to make mistakes. And I'm very happy that nobody died because of my mistakes. But one mistake that I made is I went out to give a lesson to a student who was ready to solo. And after some good landings, I signed my student off and said, go do your solo. And she took off in the airplane and she did 2 very good landings. But on the third one, it was really windy and the plane was unstable. And that's when I was watching, that's when I realized I never taught her how to do a go around. I knew how to do a go around, but I never taught her because her landings were good and I wasn't being careful and I wasn't keeping up with my studies. She did fine and she did it because she read the book. But one of the things that I learned was I had to keep studying and I had to do it, not just because I wanted to be safe, but because from an attitude, I wanted to make sure the people around me saw me studying, saw me with the book, so that they also would be the same way. When we talk about safety and we talk about evaluation, one of the most important things that we will ever do is evaluate ourselves. And for pilots, that is very hard to do. A self-evaluation is when I look at myself and I see what I'm doing flying wise, and I ask myself the question, is there anything that I can do better? Many times that's hard for a pilot. But if I am being honest and I am looking at what I'm doing, I'm evaluating myself and I'm seeing what I'm doing right and I'm seeing what I'm doing wrong, and I'm being careful every time that I fly. As a pilot examiner, I fly every day. I'm in the air probably 2 or 3 times a day. I have just finished logging 20,000 hours. But when I get in the airplane, I remind myself that I have to consistently evaluate what I'm doing and how I'm doing it. Because if I don't evaluate myself, then I will not be able to see when I'm getting close to being unsafe. Many times as a pilot, one of the things that we think about is I have to get ready for my check ride. So I've evaluated myself, but now I'm getting ready for my check ride. And sometimes as a flight instructor or as a pilot, I can think that the most important part of what I'm doing is to be ready for a check ride. But that's not the most important evaluation. The most important evaluation is real life. Sometimes a check ride is easier to study for than real life. Most of the time, you know everything that is on the test. Most of the time, you know the examiner and you know the way that they ask questions. It is very common for somebody to finish a check ride and then all of their other students ask them, what was on the test? What did he ask you? How did you fly? What did you do first? And we're thinking about the test. Well, as a pilot and as a flight instructor, one of the things that we need to remember is the most important check ride is not the check ride for GACA or the FAA. The most important check ride is real life. Real life is far more of a check ride than the day that the inspector or the DPE evaluates your flying. Because if you don't do well for the examiner, no problem. You can come back next week and finish the check ride. But if you don't do well in the check ride that life gives you, then you have a worse problem. It is not uncommon to have somebody so focused on the passing of a check ride that they don't think about real life and they don't think about being prepared for what comes next. As we, as pilots, evaluate ourselves and evaluate what is next and evaluate what could be around the corner, it's important to remember how we train for today. It's not just about the check ride. It's about real life. For example, many times an examiner will not give you an emergency that can't be simulated safely. Like I will not turn the engine off on a single engine check ride. I will simulate it with throttle. And I will do it at an altitude to where if you don't fix it, I can fix it. Because I don't want to die. I'd like to stay alive. So real life does not care what altitude you are at when the engine decides to stop. So it's important as a pilot that I am always thinking, what could happen? Am I prepared? Am I thinking? My instructor was a crazy man, and he did things in the airplane that sometimes were not safe. And he would cut the engines off at very low altitudes. One time in a multi-engine airplane, he cut off the fuel to both engines just to see what I would do. And he was always thinking, but one of the good things that he would say to me is, if you do not train for everything, you can be sure that that is what is going to happen. So he would make me think through how to train for it. As a pilot, evaluating yourself, it is very important for you to think through every little part of the flight. Am I doing this right? Am I doing the next part right? Am I getting ready to take off? Am I following my checklist? Sometimes it's easy. There's many airplanes that I fly where I have the checklist memorized and I can turn everything on that I need and go fly. But I won't let myself do that. I'll make myself follow the checklist. Why? It takes more time, but I am making sure that I am doing the right thing, and that matters. And I'm making sure that the people that are watching me see me do the right things. Many of you pilots in here are very experienced and well-respected and very good at what you do. If you, as a well-respected pilot, if you follow all of the little steps for safety, you will pass on to everybody that is watching you how to be safe. That is important because that affects the entire community. The FAA says that learning is multifaceted, meaning that if I am learning from you, I am not just learning what you are saying. I'm not just learning what you are doing, but I am watching you and I'm learning from that attitude. And that is very important. So as a pilot, maybe you're not an instructor, but you are a pilot and you are well respected. If you do the right thing professionally, the pilots around you will do the right thing. Because as a community, we all do it together. As a flight instructor, if you do the right thing, your students will do the right thing. So the real evaluation for a pilot is not the check ride, it's real life. We've already talked a little bit about this. Let's go to the next one. Okay. If you are evaluating yourself after a flight and you can't find something to do better, I would encourage you to look harder, because every pilot on every flight can find something that you can do better. Every time that I fly, I try to think about to myself, what can I do better? What can I do better? What can I do better? Because I know that if I do this, I will constantly be at a place where I will not let myself make the mistake that can kill somebody, that can kill me. It is not uncommon for a pilot with lots of flight time to make one mistake, and that one mistake caused them a fatality. The man that killed my best friend, he had thousands and thousands of hours, but he let an attitude come in. He was not evaluating himself correctly, and the end result was he made a fatal mistake. Many times the mistakes that we make that hurt us are not just one mistake, but it's the attitude, I don't have to follow all of the rules. And I'll make a little mistake and a little mistake and a little mistake. And the next thing you know, you've made a mistake which causes an accident. I fly with flight instructors and flight instructor applicants more than just about any other type of pilot. I do a lot of flight instructor check rides. I do airline transport pilot check rides. And I have found that the greater the rating that I am doing, the more careful I have to be watching to make sure that they do the small things right. On the average, 6 or 7 times a year, when I am getting ready to fly, I find a fuel cap or an oil cap not on properly. And this is from a flight instructor. So the reason for that is sometimes we can be so good at what we do that we begin to get a little bit careless. And so as pilots, one of the safest things that we will do is make sure we're doing the small things properly. I was getting ready to go fly with an applicant, and it was not an applicant for a check ride. It was like a instructor standardization flight. The flight school had hired several instructors. They wanted me to fly with them to see if they were safe. I had already flown with one man, he did fine. I flew with another one, he did fine. And a third one was up. And I'm drinking coffee, watching out the window as he does his check around the airplane. I noticed he did not check the fuel sample. And this plane, like your 172s, had 13 fuel sumps. He did not check one of them. So I'm drinking coffee and I'm watching him. And you know, you have to check the fuel samples for contaminants. It's on the checklist, it's in the POH, it's good common sense. And I'm watching him doesn't check it. He comes inside. He says, okay, I'm ready to go fly. And I said, okay. Have you checked the fuel samples? He goes, yes, sir. And I said, I want you to look out the window at the airplane that I see. And then he realized I could see him. And he goes, no, I didn't check. And I said, why not? And he said, because this plane has already flown 2 times. If there was anything wrong with the fuel, we would already know it. I said, okay, we have to follow the checklist. Let's go out to the airplane. And so I'm still drinking my coffee and I'm standing there and he checks the first sample and it's the big jar. And half of the jar that he filled up was water and the other half was fuel. He dumped it out and went to the next one, same thing, half water, half fuel. And the third one, half water, half fuel. And he turned around and looked at me and he didn't know what to say. And I said, you just killed us both. Because if we got in that airplane, it's going to fail. As soon as we point the nose up, the engine's going to die. And the problem was not that he did not know the right thing to do. The problem was on that day, he decided he didn't need to do it. And the day that he decided not to do it was the day that it really mattered. So as a pilot, as a flight instructor, it's important that the small things, that we do the small things for safety, because that defines who we are. That defines the being a professional. That defines having integrity, because we're going to do the small things and you will save your life. I have been flying for more than 25 years. I do not ever get into an airplane that I do not check it myself. I do not ever get in an airplane to fly that I don't check the fuel and the oil, that I do not make sure that everything can move, because I find problems all the time that my applicant does not find, or another flight instructor, or even another examiner. I just always check it. And we could talk all night about some of the things that I have found. That there was one time where I was checking the airplane for us to go fly, and there was a control rod that was missing the nut on the back. All you had to do was move the elevator and the rod dropped off and there was no elevator control. He just never checked it. I was checking the landing gear on a Piper Seminole for a CFI check ride flight, and none of the nuts had the cotter pin in any of the landing gear. And a couple of them were already starting to unscrew. How embarrassing would it be for us to go fly and a wheel falls off? And how embarrassing would it be to have to land with one of your landing gear that doesn't work, when it's clear you could have found the problem? It's very important that you always do your pre-flight, that you always do the little things, because I have found that the little things are normally what causes an accident. We had an airline pilot in America that he had his own airplane, and he lived in a small aviation community, and he would fly to Fort Lauderdale or Miami to get onto the airlines. And he crashed his airplane. And when the FAA inspectors were sifting through the wreckage to find out why, he had the control lock still in the yoke. He just didn't take the control lock out of the yoke. He did everything else, started up the plane, and tried to take off with the control lock still in. It's the little things as pilots, as we evaluate ourselves, that we'll see, hey, am I doing this or am I not? One of the ways that we can really help ourselves is make sure that when we're in a community of pilots, that we're helping each other out by remembering that. Sometimes it is embarrassing for me if I forget something to have a student point it out, or to have another instructor point it out, or another examiner. It can be embarrassing, but it's never going to be as embarrassing as having an incident or an accident that could be saved. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about this, and then we're going to go right on to CFIs, and I want to talk to my flight instructors for just a minute. But if you're ever getting ready for a check ride, the self-evaluation process will be far better than the instructor's evaluation. The reason is, if you are evaluating yourself on every little thing that you do, you will begin to catch the mistakes before your instructor can catch them. And that helps your instructor, but it also helps you. Remember that most flight checks, we have a minimum standard that we're grading you to. If you are my student, I'm training you up here. I'm going to give you the best flight training that I can possibly give you. I'm going to try to teach you everything I know. But if I am your examiner, I am required to examine you by the PTS or the ACS. I'm not allowed to evaluate you at my standard. I have to evaluate you at the FAA standard or the GACA standard or whatever standard of check ride I'm doing. So it may be that the standard is land here or 200 feet. My standard would be land here. I would train you to land here. If this is your point, I could train you to land here. But when I evaluate you, I have to evaluate you from the rules, which is the minimum standard. So for me, when I'm flying, I do not ever grade myself based on the minimum standard. I grade myself based on the highest standard I can possibly give myself. So if you are preparing for a check ride, the best way is to prepare yourself and require more from yourself than the examiner requires. I have to require the minimum. You train for the maximum. You require the maximum out of your skills, out of your knowledge, out of your judgment, and the check ride will be easy. If you are requiring yourself up here, I am requiring you here, the check ride is very, very easy. So require from yourself every day to be higher than the standard, but not just check ride day. Your most dangerous flight that you will ever take is the day after a check ride. You've been training, you've been evaluated, and you feel like I've passed. And then the next day, you may not be as careful. Always require the highest level from yourself, and you will see your skills grow and grow and grow exponentially until you are the best pilot that you can possibly be. Let's talk about CFIs for a minute. Now, I know that some of you are flight instructors, and I've met some of you that are studying to be flight instructors. I would like to make a sales pitch, if you don't mind. Many of you have the skill set to be a flight instructor, but you are not a flight instructor yet. I would like to encourage you to consider it. Consider becoming a flight instructor. Even if you only train one person or two people, your general aviation community is growing and growing and growing. And this is wonderful. It is good for everybody. It is good for the country. It is good for aviation. It is good for everything. You will need flight instructors. You will need flight instructors that train every day, but you'll also need flight instructors that are a little bit different. We have some of them at the airports that I'm at. These are instructors that they're too busy to do flight instruction every day, but they have one or two students. They mentor, sometimes they mentor a higher level student, or they mentor on a faster airplane or a bigger airplane. I would like to encourage you if you are not a flight instructor, to consider exploring becoming a flight instructor, even if it's not your primary job. It will be good for the aviation community, it'll be good for your flight clubs, and it'll be good for general aviation as a whole. So that's my sales pitch. The job of the flight instructor is to work yourself out of a job. It is to come to the place in your training where you are no longer needed. A flight instructor is very valuable in training the next generation of pilots. But there comes a point in time where the best training you can do is to not say a word. Your goal is to get them to that point. In some ways, it's like raising children. If your child is 3 or 4 years old, they need a lot of help. But if they are 30 years old and they need a lot of help, there may be a parenting problem. Your flight instructors, their job is to work themselves out of a job, to get to the place where they have trained their pilots so well, where the flight instructor is not necessary. The only way to know if your student is ready is to evaluate the student properly. Now, whether you're a pilot or a flight instructor or an evaluator, there are some keys to evaluation that are good for everybody to think about. Evaluation and training are two different things, and many times flight instructors get them confused. One of the ways that this is the most apparent to me when I am doing a check ride is when the student will do something that is wrong, and they do what is wrong, and then when we land and we're in the debrief, the instructor says, "This has never happened before. They have never done this before." And the student is confused. They don't understand why they did what they did. The CFI is confused. They don't understand why the student did it. But to me, I've seen it before, and it goes like this. The student and the instructor are in the airplane, and the student always forgets something, and the CFI always helps. Sometimes it's pulling the gear up. So they're learning how to fly a multi-engine, they're taking off down the runway, they rotate, and as they come up, the student is slow to put the landing gear up. And the CFI will say, "Landing gear." The student then reaches down and puts the gear up. Now, if the instructor does not know the difference between training and evaluation, sometimes the CFI will say, "I think the student's doing the right thing." But the student is not doing what he knows to do, he's doing what he's been told to do. And that is the difference. Evaluation is when you sit back and you let the pilot or the student do what they're doing, and you talk to them. Whereas training is, you are telling them what to do, you are teaching them what to do, you are instructing. Now, the difference is, on the first day of training, the training is the pink line, you have to do it all. You have to tell them how to untie the airplane. You have to tell them how to start the airplane. You have to tell them everything, and they have to do it. On the first day, there's very little evaluation. Now, there may be a little bit where you're asking yourself, is my student understanding what I'm doing? But you're doing almost all teaching. Now, midway through their training, you're doing half training and half evaluation. So there's still some maneuvers that they should do and know how to do it, and you're evaluating them. And then there's some things that you have to actively teach them. This is what my student has to do. On the last day, before they go to their examiner, your flying with the student should be almost all evaluation. You are sitting there, You are not saying anything. You are just letting them do everything on their own. If you don't evaluate in that way, you don't know if they're ready. The biggest problem where this pops up is in soloing a student. If you solo a student when you have not properly evaluated them, you don't know whether or not they're going to be safe or not. Without an evaluation that's done properly, you don't know if they're ready. This goes for when you move into bigger aircraft. This goes when you move to another rating. It's really, really important that you know the difference between training and evaluation. For example, if I'm evaluating a student and I'm doing a check ride, I will tell them during this check ride, you are the pilot in command, not me. Please do not expect me to do anything. I will not help you with this. I will not speak. And then I will say, if I have to intervene, it is unsatisfactory because I'm not supposed to help you. And so I won't do anything for the student, not on the radios, not on the controls. I will not be involved. If the flight instructor is not doing the exact same thing, the student is going to have problems because I'm not there to help. So if we're in the traffic pattern and my student forgets to put the flaps down, I'm not an instructor who's going to say, hey, don't forget your flaps. I can't say that. So it's important on an evaluation before the student comes to me that the flight instructor knows this is how to evaluate. I will not be involved. So you're gradually moving to the point of not being involved. That doesn't mean you're not training, but it means that that training is in the debrief, not in the actual flight. If you do that, you will gradually teach your student to do everything on their own. And that's what you want. Because the day they take their check ride, now they're going to go fly without you. The flight instructor in this particular profession that we're in is more important than the examiner. I only see a student for a few hours in the oral exam, a few hours in the flight, and I do a test. I am not as important as the flight instructor who sees the student a lot, and they train and train and train and train and train. So the most important part of getting the student ready for real life is the evaluation, where you are evaluating them by not being involved in what they're doing. To the degree that you interfere with what they're doing, to that degree, you don't know if they're ready. If you have to always grab the radios for your student will not know how to use the radios. So when it comes to evaluation, that is one of the more important things. So like we said, day one is a silent evaluation, but the last day, the only teaching that you're doing is the evaluation at the end of the brief. That's why on a check ride, I'm not allowed to teach, but I do take notes. So when the check ride is complete, I'm able to give feedback. And the feedback that I'm able to give hopefully will help, but it's not meant to teach because it's an evaluation. Does that make sense? Okay. Right. With an evaluation, if you do not evaluate, you do not know. If something is unevaluated, it is uncertain whether or not that they know it. If the student is doing so poorly that you have to step in, it's okay, but you're not evaluating anymore. At that point, you are training. Okay. Okay. For examiners, there's going to be an increasing need for examiners as the general aviation population in Saudi Arabia explodes and grows and grows and grows. You are going to need lots more flight instructors and you'll need lots more examiners. So that is a really good reason if you are an experienced pilot and you are building your flight time and you fly all kinds of different aircraft to become a flight instructor so that one day you can help this need. If you don't have enough examiners, it will be a bottleneck and it'll get in the way of the growth that you really want to see and that it seems like you're on your way to. So I know where I live right now in America, we do not have enough examiners. And there are pilots, some pilots have to wait months as they're getting ready. Every now and then it'll catch up and the examiners will work hard and we'll have good weather, but we don't have enough examiners either. But as you're getting ready for that, hopefully you that are the career flight instructors continually think about that, hey, one day they're going to need more examiners. And that's a need that is very slow to fill. If you need an airplane, you can buy an airplane. But if you need an examiner, they take a long time to train. So you that are flight instructors, one of the best ways that you can prepare to help propel your aviation growth forward is to be ready to be an examiner. And the best way to do that is to be a good evaluator as a flight instructor. When it comes to what you evaluate, and for you flight instructors, what you train, and for you that are chief pilots or evaluators of any kind, the best way to craft your scenario is to craft your scenarios based on accident statistics. Where I live in Florida, one of our highest accident statistics right now is loss of control in flight. That leads to a spin, and it's the stall spin accident. So as an evaluator, as a flight instructor, and as an examiner, I craft my scenarios and my exams and training to try and fix that problem. So it's important for you as the professional pilots to see what are the accidents going on in your community, in your area, and in your country. And then to have a good idea of what's going on in other parts of the world. Because an airplane is an airplane and a pilot is a pilot. And so if you know what some of the accident problems are in other parts of the world, in your community, in your country, as an evaluator, you can begin to tailor your scenarios to try and solve that problem. If you test it, the instructors will train it. So if you're going to be an examiner and you want to really impact safety, test the things that are the biggest problems. The two biggest problems that we have in Florida right now in aviation is the stall spin accident and then loss of control on takeoff and landing. We just had this problem with student pilots lately that as they are taking off and landing, they're losing control and running off the runway or hitting the nose gear. It's a simple fix. I got a chance to watch a lot of you do takeoffs and landings today. And they look like some pretty good landings, look like some pretty good takeoffs. I mean, I still can't figure out the whole gyro plane, how it take off and land, but it looked like it was pretty good. But with the takeoffs and the landings, let's say that you had a problem here, that your 172s, the nose strut was always needing to be replaced, that the Archer, the nose strut was compressing and that needs to be replaced, and you kept banging the prop on takeoff and landing. Well, the way to solve that problem is the flight instructors train it, the evaluators test it, and everybody looks at, hey, this is the problem and this is how can we make this better? And it becomes the focus. Once you've solved that problem, there will always be another one to solve. But as a community, if you test it, if you train it, if you emphasize it, you can absolutely knock that problem out. Let's see, is there a slide after that one? Yeah, okay, so an examiner should always be a mentor for a CFI. When you become an examiner, one of the things that you really want to do is help mentor the CFI. The CFI what you want to always do is mentor the younger pilot. You that are pilots that are flying something faster and it goes longer and it's bigger and more complex, if you're always mentoring the other pilots around you, you will change the way the aviation community is. It is something that really does work together. And when you have some knowledge and you can pass that along, it helps everybody around you as far as safety goes. And we've talked a little bit about testing as far as scenarios, what a rote scenario is and what an authentic test is. When I do a check ride, I do not ever ask yes or no questions. I will always ask a scenario. And the reason for that is real life is a scenario. So if I'm a pilot and I'm going to self-evaluate, I did this just 4 weeks ago. I realized that I had not flown a multi-engine by myself on an instrument flight in 6 months. Well, I have a lot of flight time, but I also know that people with a lot of flight time still make mistakes. And so in order for me to be professional, what I did is I got a Piper Seminole, I got an instructor, and we flew and we did an instrument flight where I did all of the emergencies, losing the engine, single engine approach, landing gear problems, and I walked through the whole thing. But I did it as a scenario because I can answer the questions rote, but the scenario trains real life. And so as a pilot trying to be better at what you do, as an instructor trying to make a better student, and as an examiner trying to evaluate and lift up aviation safety, the more that you can be authentic with what you do, in other words, it's a real life scenario, the better it's going to be than just a yes or no rote question. Hopefully that helps a little bit. Okay. I think we're going to do questions. Is that what we're going to do?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much for the over very informative. I really appreciate it. I think I'm finishing for 20,000 hours. Mine. The question is, how would be in any situation, and how did you behave?
In any what type
In
of
this situation during the flight? Have you been in this situation, and how did you?
like an emergency? Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
How did you behave?
Okay. Thank you for your question. Could you tell me your name?
Sir.
Son? Nice to meet you. Yes, yeah, I've had a few in the 20,000 hours. I've had a couple of engine failures and a couple of engine fires, but it wasn't as dramatic as it sounds. It just smoked a little bit. I've had a couple of systems failures along the way, like with landing gear or things like that. But early in my training, my instructor taught me that you will never, we have a phrase in America called rise to the occasion, where it means if you perform at this level on a normal basis, and then you have an emergency, rise to the occasion means now you perform at this level. And we think about that with sports, with soccer and football and things, but my instructor taught me that never happens. You never rise to the occasion, but because of stress, you sink to the lowest level of your effective training. So when he said that, he said, you have all the knowledge you need to stay alive. But if you don't practice your knowledge, when you have an emergency, you won't stay alive. So I try every single day that I fly to think about and train for different emergencies. So when they happen, I'm ready. So I think some of my scariest times have been when I was with a student who they're doing something and then they just did something crazy. And I was flying with a student in a twin engine, giving them training, and they were adjusting the fuel mixture, and we hit some turbulence. And we were at 1,000 feet traffic pattern. And as soon as we hit the turbulence, his hand came down and he killed both engines and they were dead. Well, I remember in that moment, my instructor saying, fly the airplane, fly the airplane, fly the airplane. So I just grabbed the airplane and flew it, put the fuel back on. And I have found that in an emergency, if I'm always practicing and I'm always getting myself mentally ready, then on the day that it happens, it's not as big of a deal. But if you concentrate and if you're always training yourself and you concentrate and fly the airplane, then you can get out of almost any emergency. It's a good question. Do we have another?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Really enjoyed it. And we try a lot to remember the lots of priorities. There are sometimes they don't have the checklist or they forget the checklist. Or sometimes they have the checklist. They need to do quickly. And check it, okay, you know, so sometimes, and when you wish and do some, I think a lot of people.
Right.
So how important is that checklist? Don't put checklist. And how important is the fuel sum for the flight?
Well, as far as the fuel sump goes, I can just tell you what the FAA says. The FAA says that we have to follow our POH. And the POH for most aircraft say that you must sump it after every fuel and you must sump it before the first flight of the day. To be honest, I have not found many problems with the fuel. And we live in Florida, which is very humid all the time. So if you're going to get moisture, Florida is where you're going to get it in the tanks. I haven't found it that often, but in more than 25 years of flying, I found it maybe 10 times. Any one of those could have killed me. And so I'm glad I found them those 10 times. So I recommend always sumping the fuel, because the one day you don't sump it, there may be a problem. As far as the checklist goes, one of the reasons that we are given a checklist is not for a beautiful day like this. This was a perfect day. And the winds were 10 knots. The skies were blue. You could see forever. It was beautiful. And nobody had a problem today flying. Everybody took off. Everybody landed. No problem. But the checklist is for the day when things go bad and you're already under stress. When you're under stress from flying and then there's an emergency, it is likely that you could forget something important. And it could be something you would never forget on a different day. And I have seen that happen. I had an engine failure in a Seminole one time. The left engine fails. The student has the checklist, and it was an actual failure. When he turned off the electronic boost pump, the engine-driven pump had already failed. So when he turned it off, I watched the fuel pressure drop to 0, and we had enough altitude. I wasn't going to step in. I wanted him to feel the engine fail. So I just sat back, and the engine failed, and the aircraft began to yaw into the dead engine, and he quickly started going through the checklist, except he wasn't following the checklist. He was going through it. He had it memorized. And when he said fuel, he checked the mixture and he checked the fuel selectors, but he missed the pump. Now on the checklist, it says auxiliary fuel pump as one of the first items, because normally that's what caused it to fail. So not only did he have one failure with the pump, but he didn't follow his checklist. I recommend always, always, always following the checklist.
When you wish at that time, you got one thing. Yeah, so I think some of the guys followed me in the class of 2007. We go from Korea to Jordan Qatar and the other embarrassing. The kids got the also interview. And then he got me and like, take up. He said, no, I didn't say any still the art. He said, I'm not this year. I said, apply. You can buy money, you go for it. Then you will find to give to 11,000 for the sales. So then they got money. Clients but still. And everything is done. I was on this first one, then of course, if I didn't do much. And then online that things not fun. And when you reach 9,000, it's from the store. So you can make your life and then you buy. And then you are guiding
That's great.
that's what we said. That's for first time.
Yes,
You have something like
that's right. And when you have a stressful time in the airplane, it never happens with a green light that goes off and says, now will be the time for stress. And then you get it creeps up on you. I had almost the exact same thing happen with me, except the controller was talking to us while we were doing our engine check. And I was checking the magnetos, and it was a big twin. And so there was a lot of magnetos to check. And I didn't turn one of the magnetos back on. And my instructor saw it. I remember me telling you, my instructor was a crazy man. He saw me not turn the magneto back on, and he let me take off with it off just to see. And as we're climbing out, he's got his arms folded and he goes, it doesn't climb well like this, does it? And I didn't know what was wrong. And he's just laughing and he goes, you'll figure it out. And I'd never used my checklist to check everything right because I was distracted. So the checklist is great for a day like this, but it was made for the day when the stress and the pressure is on and you don't have time to do it 2 or 3 times a different way. So, yes, sir.
Yes, I'm just asking about the personal course and we might should have a personal,
Yes.
especially after getting a certificate. What is the best scenario go through that personal minimum and increase it? How we can guide us for planning? What's your advice in this regard?
Yes, sir. That is a very, very good question. The personal minimum is very important at the beginning to set very, very narrow, because it is always better to fly on a better day when you're learning. There's no shame in saying this day I'm not flying today. And it could be that the minimum is a weather minimum, but it could also be a stress minimum. You know, it could be that on some days, there's too much stress from work, from home. I just got in trouble with a police officer while I was driving, whatever it is. And the weather added together could be dangerous. But if we're just talking about expanding weather minimums, there are 2 ways to safely expand your own personal minimums. And one of them is experience. If you just keep flying and holding yourself to a high standard, then those minimums will expand naturally. The other way is when you want to expand your minimum and it is a challenging day, get with a flight instructor or somebody who has that type of experience and go fly. And if you do that, you will find that you're probably better than you think you are. And with the instructor looking over your shoulder, you'll have the confidence to try it, and then you can go out and get better at it. The worst way to expand your personal minimums is to go by yourself on a day that is way beyond your minimums just to see if you can make it work. That's not a good idea. Sometimes when I was learning to fly and trying to get better, I would plan a long flight and I would make sure that the weather at one airport was good. And then I would find an airport with higher winds or crosswinds, and I would go try, with telling myself, I'll go around if I have to, I'll come back. And so I would just try and see what I could handle. And that has helped as well. So experience, and the other one is flying with a flight instructor as you get better and better. Or if you have another pilot who has flown a lot and you're like, hey, I would just like to fly, it's gusting to 28. I'd like to go up with you and try it out. And then you go try it. That's a good question. Yes, sir.
Man, thank you for the great. I'm not a pilot. But I work under the right seat. I was working in the forward.
Okay.
And I have two things about that. The first one for the south, for the fuel rate. I had an incident with a friend of mine. He was a pilot, and he failed to do that, and he failed to pilot the technology. He managed to do that very fast. They don't reach forward. Second thing, most of my pilots, I used to fly with them, but again, they cross country, they take right seat, they receive and right seat there, but I feel some time with them, not a lot of fun. However, they used to do a lot of things, and that used to be required from their FAA. So, for you to pass an exam, at that time, but I heard that they stopped doing that, no longer, you do actually trade for spin. In my opinion, I think that's a really important thing, because that's what happened when you saw the new like yourself. And as you said, that training is different than living ends, right?
Right.
I can train how to recover spin, but really reaching it, it's a bit different. So why did the FAA stop this? If I'm correct, the training for recovery for the spin.
A flight instructor is still required to demonstrate spins. They have to be trained on it, and they can, once they've had their training and they're signed off, they're okay on the check ride to demonstrate it verbally. A private, a commercial, they have to be able to have the knowledge of it, what it is, what caused the spin, and how to get out. But only the flight instructor is required to either demonstrate it or have training with it signed off saying you've done the spins. When I agree with you, when I got my private pilot back in the 90s, you had to do a spin. So my instructor taught me spins before he soloed me, and I'm glad he did. Now, my first instructor was not a good instructor, and he taught me spins, and I went out and I practiced them when I was a student pilot. And I should not have done that, but he never told me I shouldn't have, so I just did. But I think the FAA was concerned that too many people were getting hurt practicing them. So I think it's a cycle, and I think, maybe it'll go back. But spin awareness is required by everybody for FAA. Thank you.
So, my name is Mansoor. I am MS of mechanical engineer. I am a power parachute pilot. And my question is the relation between the runway and the load of the pilot, how the pilot calculates the distance that he should take off the aircraft. Always asking this question for some pilots. Until now, I didn't have a satisfied answer. Is it done automatically by the something like equations with calculation of the pilot, or it is Did they go the estimate about this is the time to do.
That is a very good question. And actually, on every test that I do for private, commercial flight instructor and airline transport pilot, they have to calculate takeoff distance with a given weight and given atmospheric conditions. In every POH, Pilot's Operating Handbook or Approved Flight Manual, after a certain date, and I think that's in the late 60s, early 70s, everyone after that has charts. And you are supposed to go in there and enter the weight of the aircraft, enter the atmospheric conditions, and from that, you should have an exact takeoff distance, a landing distance, a distance over a 50-foot obstacle in case you had a tree or something building down there. And also for a multi-engine, the accelerate stop distance. So those are, they're in the POH, and every pilot is supposed to do a calculation before every flight. And on a check ride, I check it. I have to. But I also, when we go out to fly, I let them see it, because many of them, to be honest, many times somebody is trained to fly and they know how to do the chart, but it's not really as required. And so they don't keep up with it. But I like for them to do it and then us go fly it and see, oh, the numbers are right. I can take off in, 300 meters and I can be in the air, or 500 meters. And it's good to know that. There are many, many accidents with people that do not calculate that, and they try to take off and the temperatures are high. I mean, we know just from being here that the way your airplane performs today and the way your airplane will perform on July 1 in the same place, two totally different things. You have 13,000 feet out here. Imagine if you only had 2,000 feet. Some of your airplanes will fly in February and will not fly in July. So the charts are very important. It's a good question. Yes, sir.
Well, with this opportunity after 1 year, my question, what I know that I'm seeking for the golden advice from someone experienced like you. So what's exactly the golden advice?
The golden advice to be a safe pilot? Always, always, always evaluate yourself, but always tell yourself every single day, this could be the day that I make a dumb mistake and crash an airplane. I tell myself that every day. I have flown, I've got lots of flight time and many years, and sometimes I can find myself being complacent. Like I can look out the window and I can tell by the angle of the wing if he is in a steep turn and if it's within standards. And so I can look at the golf course and see who's playing, and I can know whether or not they're doing it. But if I do that, I'm not looking for traffic. I'm not looking at the instruments to make sure that the engines are running right. And so I tell myself the golden advice, I believe, is every day you get into an airplane is to remember this could be the day that you make a dumb mistake and end your flying career. So I think that's the best. That's what helps keep me sharp.
Three stall spins in the last 2 years. Can you help understand how this happens, how we get into this situation? You cannot have a stall spin in 300 feet. So can you help us understand why this would happen? Because we've had this happen twice.
I believe that as a flight instructor, that the number one reason that we get into a stall spin on takeoff is because we do not believe that the engine has just failed. We do not believe that it can happen to us. The hardest thing in the world to do when you're a pilot is to come to the realization that you're no longer able to fly and you have to put the airplane down immediately. That is very, very hard to do. Because We really, really want the airplane to fly. And sometimes during an emergency, we do not think clearly. There has to come a point where you make a decision in an emergency that you're no longer able to fly. I was doing a check ride in a Seminole and we had shut one engine down and it would not restart. And every time we attempted to restart, we had one system failed. The unfeathering accumulator just failed. And then the second system, the electrical system, was not working properly to get the engine started. And so we tried to start the engine 5 times. And then I realized we had dropped 1,000 feet in the process. And I realized that I was setting us up for an accident. The plane will fly just fine on one engine, but it won't fly fine on one engine with me distracted trying to save the other engine, when really I just needed to fly the airplane. The moment I decided I cannot restart this engine, I have to declare an emergency, I have to land it on one engine, everything went fine after that. It was no event. The fire trucks came out, but they were terribly disappointed that there was no work for them to do. And all I had to do was call my FAA boss and say, we landed on one engine. But in the middle of the problem, I'm distracted with not realizing the truth. If you are on takeoff before you hit the throttle in an aircraft, you have to be mentally prepared that the engine's going to fail. My instructor, the good one, the crazy one, used to always say, the day you don't believe the engine's going to fail, it will fail and it'll kill you. And so every day when I'm getting ready to take off, I'm telling myself, this engine will fail. And at each moment of the climb out, I know what I'm going to do. And I had the problem happen and I wasted no time. I was climbing out 200 feet. My engine lost half of its power. And immediately I knew the airplane was not going to fly. And so I shoved the nose over. That can be very, very scary to be in an airplane. And now you're going to have to shove the nose over. But if you do that, you will not stall, you will not spin. I mean, you may get the airplane dirty, but you will walk away. So the reason that we have stall spins on takeoff is, number one, the mental preparation for takeoff is not there. And second, the moment it happens, you have to realize the plane is not going to fly. It's now a glider. And just get the nose over and put it down somewhere safe, and you will walk away. And most likely, you'll get to use your airplane again. But the important thing is you and your passengers are safe. The reason we have stall spins on takeoff is when the emergency happens, we do not want to admit it is an emergency. We do want to admit that now your day is going to be different. That's what I believe is what happens every time.
Just that a lot of people think that they don't know what altitude they can come back from. So in Mama, we have 1,160 is the altitude at the Hangar. So you are 500 feet, you cannot get out. You are 600 feet, you cannot get out. So it's difficult to say that it is the right, it is the left. But 1,000, you might have a chance to get around and then go to Burma. A lot of people try, they don't know that. They think that, oh, I have an engine failure, I will go back. And here where they usually fall into spin or stall.
Right. Yes, and it's different. It's different with every airplane, and it's different with every pilot. One of the maneuvers that I have practiced over the years is called the impossible turn, where I would go up to 4,000 feet. I would set the plane trim for takeoff. I would slow down to VY. And then I would, from 4,000 feet, I would climb up to 4,300 feet. And at 4,300 feet, I would pull the throttle all the way back to simulate an engine failure. And then I would count to 3. And the reason I would count to 3 would be, that's the delay you would have when you go, oh no, this can't happen, can't be happening. Oh no, it is happening. And so you count to 3 and then you begin your turn back, and you don't turn 180 degrees. You turn 180 plus another 30 to get where you're going, and you measure and see how much altitude you've lost. And most of the time with most pilots, if they're not controlling the aircraft right, they'll sink below that 4,000. And it's a good demonstration that, hey, you can't do this at 300 feet. Let's try 400. Let's try 500. And eventually you'll get to that point. But the danger is if you've practiced it enough to where you can get it back safely, if you don't consistently practice the maneuver and you're not mentally in tune, the problem will be you'll think you can do it because you've done it before, but you're rusty and you won't make it. So the most important thing is get the nose over, keep the airspeed up, and if you can make it back to the runway and you have sufficient altitude, safely do it. But always be ready to abandon it, level the wings, and land under power, meaning land under control. And you'll be safe and walk away. And it doesn't matter to your family whether you've landed the airplane on the runway or landed on a wadi or landed in the desert or a street. They just want you to come home. And you can do that if you constantly make sure that you follow the right procedure. And it's a mental game. It's a mental game. If I can't make it, my nose is going over. And on every runway I fly out of, I always have a out. I always know what'll happen. And there are some runways where I know that if I take off, I have no options for 300 or 400 feet. And I do a good run up before I take off. So my wife will be very mad at me if I don't come home because I'm dead. So I have to be careful.
Me and my they came as a technician in aircraft and maintenance. So we are just the students. We came today to learn how to find its basic, so we have done the job of the work. So can you give us just an advice for pilot technicians as a golden advice for us?
Oh, sure. Yeah, and thank you for coming. And there's a great relationship between aviation maintenance and pilots. One of the most important things is that many of the pilot mentalities that keep us safe help a mechanic keep the pilot safe too. Now, one of them is when you are doing a checklist, you should not be distracted. So if you're doing your pre-landing checklist and somebody is in the back talking to you, that's the time for sterile cockpit. I need to do my checklist. But for you, when you're doing a maintenance checklist or you're doing a certain maintenance procedure, that's a good time to not let anybody distract you. The same stresses that can mess with us mentally can mess with you mentally. If we're not having a good day, say at home or at work, or stress, you can have the same type of stress that'll make it to where you don't do everything correctly. We had an accident in Jacksonville where a friend of mine was killed in a helicopter. And what happened with her was the mechanic was doing the annual inspection and somebody came in and interrupted him. They needed a wrench. He stopped what he was doing, found the wrench, gave it to the pilot, came back and forgot where he was and never tightened the last nut on the rotor system that he was inspecting. She was able to get 2 miles from the airfield when the rotor separated. A mechanic can be interrupted and lose their place and then cause trouble to the pilots in the same way. So pilots have to be careful that they're not interrupted. Mechanics have to be careful that they're not interrupted the same way. And so that's just a couple of things. I have really good relationships with my mechanics because I realize they do a really hard job and the way that they do their job helps me. As a pilot, the way I help mechanics is I don't interrupt them when they look like they're working. Because I don't know, they could be doing something very simple, but they could be doing something that is simple, but at the same time, if you get interrupted, it'll mess up. So as a pilot, I really appreciate the job that you do. It's an important job. And the other thing about you as a mechanic that is very, very important and honorable, you will never know how successful you are. If you're a soccer player, you are successful on the amount of goals that you make, or a goalie on how many points that you save. But as a mechanic, you are the most successful when people do not crash and do not die. Rarely do I ever call my mechanic at the end of the day and say, hey, thank you, I didn't die today. You know, because it's the kind of job that people don't always remember. But with an airline captain, when somebody gets off the plane and it's been a bumpy landing, they're like, thank you, because I know it was windy. So a mechanic, they don't always get the same thank you. Not having accidents and having everybody go home at night is very important. So thank you for your work.
He's a mechanic though.
Uh, I have heard that the two most dangerous things in aviation is a mechanic with a pilot certificate and a pilot with a wrench.
Exactly.
You have both of them. It's good. Any other questions or?
Any more questions? That's enough. You good?
Um, Thank you. One of, just one quick thing, and then I'll be quiet, I promise. One of the most exciting times in America was when the general aviation component of America grew. They called it the golden age in aviation. It was so much fun. There were so many new things that people could do, so much fun that they had, so many new aircraft that came out, and it was an awesome time. I was talking with another pilot last night about this time in Saudi Arabia, and I think that this is awesome, and you are going to look back on this time as awesome and wonderful that you were part of building something that is so great, as in everybody being able to fly and fly around the country and see the beautiful land that you have. I personally am so honored to be here, and I can't wait to come back. And I can't wait to get home and tell all my Saudi pilot friends that I actually got to come to Riyadh and see their home. So you have all been wonderful to me. If I can ever help any of you in any way possible, I'm going to make sure my contact information is everywhere. And you have a friend, just let me know how I can help. I'm really, really cheering you on and can't wait to see what happens next in this airport and all the other airports. Thank you very much.
Um, Captain Matt also advised me about this lecture could be like something with the FAA record for all the pilots that's holding an FAA license.
Yes, if you have an FAA pilot certificate, then I just need to get your information and I can give you wings credit for the FAA. Unfortunately, I can't do it for GACA yet. But if I can, if you're an FAA certificated pilot, I can issue wings credit when I get back to America just by contacting our FAA and saying, hey, we had a safety meeting in Riyadh.
Yeah, I will make sure to have all the license numbers and all that. كيف ناخده يا sure. Yeah, let's go. What about taking a picture for all of us? Cool picture, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, for everyone. Yeah. Cool picture. That's
Am I taking on my own as well? Yeah. Is that okay? So, repeat. Yeah. Everyone.
oh.
I'll be quiet.
Oh, it must be in the it must be in the middle. Anyway. ايه؟ ما يا جماعة. The most important person should be in the middle. بس in the middle. Yes. عمر ايه صورت ممكن شوي بس معلش يا جماعه لا بس في توصية yeah great done
I appreciate it.
من اللي صور اخر بايفون؟
لا صور بفلوس هنا دلوقتي.